I'm so excited to be sharing my newest practice framework based on the best sort of neuro and cognitive science to help you have the most efficient, effective, and enjoyable practice sessions. My name is Josh Gu, and I'm taking my years of experience learning, teaching, and performing, and sharing all of my best clarinet and music tips so you can get more out of your practice, and most importantly, have fun. You can learn more about all of my many resources at quickstartclarinet.com, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to get notified when I post new videos. First, I want to say thank you so much for your patience. I try really hard to upload a video every week. I have been super crazy busy with lots of teaching and lots of performing, so I've had a couple weeks off here and there, but I'm going to keep working at it and keep bringing you the best content that I can. It's been great though, because in all of that teaching and performing, I'm learning new ideas and coming up with new things. And in fact, this video comes from what I've been teaching my university students this semester. So it's helping to bring you the best and most useful content. I also want to say thank you so much for recently surpassing 8,000 subscribers. It's been so awesome to just continue to see that number grow and hopefully see lots of people getting value and learning the clarinet and enjoying music and hopefully having a little bit easier time on the clarinet and music journey. I think it was 5,000 subscribers last time I said thank you in a video, and it seems like it's almost overnight that it jumped up to 8,000 now. So thank you so much for subscribing. Thanks so much for your patience as I've been sort of very busy, but am still working very hard to bring you some great helpful content. And as another way to thank you, I wanted to do something extra special for this video. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about my new framework of the 3 phases of practice and kind of giving you the big sort of overall kind of philosophy behind it and understanding of how it works and how it looks. But I'm also creating a sort of bonus training video that goes along with this. That's an in-depth demonstration of me actually applying the 3 phases of practice in one of my own practice sessions as I work on learning a piece. And I'm going to have that whole video in my free members area for you. So you can go to quickstartclarinet.com/get started, create a 100% free login for that, and check out that more in-depth video if you're interested in actually seeing these 3 phases of practice being applied in a real practice session. To start off with this new framework, I kind of want to explain a little bit about where it's come from and the background behind it. So recently I've attended a practice class and have been working with Gregg Goodhart a little bit. If you aren't familiar with Gregg Goodhart, definitely check the link in the description to see his YouTube channel. I'll also put a link to his website as well, where you can learn more about the practice classes and all that kind of fun stuff. He's definitely one of the leaders in sort of the cognitive science of learning and practicing, especially when it is applied to music. I also will put a link to Dr. Molly Gebrian's channel as well. She's another big leader in this field and these ideas. And the cool things that they're doing are taking like the latest research on how our brain learns and all of the cool science there is and understanding that we have, and actually applying it to music and showing us how to learn music. In Gregg Goodhart's practice classes, the way it works is he works in real time with a student to practice. So that might be something that you'd be interested in signing up for, and you may even be able to work with him in real time to see these things in action in your own practice. So again, check the links in the description for more information about that. However, the tricky thing about some of these things is they're pretty complex, and Gregg Goodhart and Dr. Molly Gebrian, like they do a good job of explaining it and demonstrating it, but I personally think my superpower is taking those complex things and making it even more simple and more straightforward to understand. So I've taken kind of the things that he's teaching there and sort of put it into my own framework and my own process that will hopefully be easier for you to follow and actually implement in your playing, because that's really all of our goals, is to help you practice more, help you enjoy your instrument more, and help you to make more music. So without further ado, let's get into what these 3 phases of practice are and how to apply them in your playing. So the first thing to know is that I call it sort of the 3 phases of practice, and the way it kind of lays out is pretty linear, where you sort of go phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but it's really important to know that there's lots of overlap among them. You can start doing some phase 2 techniques while you're still working kind of mostly in phase 1. You may get to phase 3 and realize you need to go back to phase 1 and fix some stuff. So it's not as linear as it seems, because nothing in life is as linear as it seems, but by putting it into a more linear process, I think that will help you to kind of see and understand how it really works and how it lays out. So phase 1 is called getting it correct, or just being correct. And this is, I think, the phase that most of us spend most of our time in when we're practicing. If you've ever heard the fantastic quote by somebody, I've always seen it attributed to Anonymous and haven't seen the actual source of the quote, but the quote is, amateurs practice until they get it right, professionals practice until they'll never get it wrong. That's kind of a sign of living in phase 1, of just getting it correct. And that's all well and good to get it correct, and if you can get it correct once, or even get it correct 60% of the time, it's not bad. That's a good spot to be in, but we want to get it correct as close to 100% of the time as possible, because that's kind of what we're going to need to do in the performance, is try to get as close to 100% correct as possible. But if we don't get it correct in the first place, then we're never going to go anywhere. With each phase, there's kind of a specific tool that I think is the most effective for accomplishing the goals of that phase. So phase 1, the goal is to get it correct. The effective tool to make that happen is simplifying. So doing a smaller chunk, and when I say a smaller chunk, it doesn't mean just, okay, I'm just going to work on this section of the piece, or even this phrase of the piece. Sometimes a smaller chunk may mean as small as 1 beat at a time, even as small as just 2 notes at a time, or something like that. Or really, even you can go even as small as just starting 1 note. Could be useful simplification and effective practice to work on really getting it correct. So my favorite way is smaller chunks. My also tied for first favorite way is to go slower. That's another way to simplify, is to go slower so that you have more bandwidth to process everything that's going on and make sure that you're getting it correct. My third way is to maybe just count the rhythm, take away the equation of, or take the clarinet playing out of the equation, take the complexities of playing the instrument out of the equation, and just work on actually knowing how the rhythm goes. Also along those lines is just generally knowing how the music goes, listening to recordings, having a clear idea of what correct is, so you have a better chance of actually getting the correct thing out of the instrument when you're playing it as well. So that's phase 1. It has to be correct. We have to know what correct is, and we have to simplify so that we have enough mental bandwidth to get everything correct. If you want to know the cognitive science term behind this to do more research on your own, this is kind of the cognitive load theory side of things. Cognitive load theory says there's kind of a limited capacity we have to really process everything and work through things. I talk about it as bandwidth all the time. That's what phase 1 is about, is simplifying, reducing the cognitive load so that you can really, truly get it correct. Thinking of some of my other frameworks that you may be familiar with as well, this is where we would be looking at kind of the 3 C's of practice, of getting it correct, feeling comfortable, confident, and in control with it being correct, and that's what's going to lead to consistency. So that's phase 1, and that's probably pretty familiar to you, especially if you're familiar with my $1 million practice process. That's 90%, 80% just really phase 1 of practicing. Now going on to phase 2 is where we start to get into some new things and some interesting different things that you may not have done, and this is again those things where you start making the shift from an amateur who gets it correct once and the professional who will never get it wrong. So phase 2 I call deep learning, or encoding is another way to think about it if you want a little bit shorter but fancier cognitive science term. But phase 2 is that deep learning or the encoding. And basically what this is really getting it into the long-term memory, getting things to stick in the brain, getting it to be where we can do it correct every time and never get it wrong because we know it so well, inside and out, upside down, forwards to backwards, backwards to forwards, all of those things. And it makes a lot of sense because the tool for this is really related to that. Knowing it forwards and backwards, backwards and forwards, upside down, all of those things. Because the tool for this is contextual interference. The tool to actually get it learned deeply, to actually encode it into your long-term memory is contextual interference. That's the fancy cognitive science term for it. Unfortunately, I don't think there's really a simpler term like simplify for the getting it correct of phase one. But contextual interference is basically messing with the context of it. If you're familiar with practice rhythms or dotted rhythms, then you've probably done some contextual interference before. Those are kind of probably the most well-known form of contextual interference. But there's all kinds of different things you can do, and there's kind of unlimited creativity for how you can change things up, how you can interfere with the context. I've heard stories of, it was a flutist, I can't remember who, but a principal flutist of a very major orchestra, maybe even in Europe, or some principal flutist of a very major orchestra was working on one of the big standard flute excerpts, like Daphnis or something like that, and he would play it and then play it in all 12 keys and transpose it to all the 12 keys, which seems like overkill, and maybe is, but he played it pretty darn well. And by transposing it to different keys, that's an example of contextual interference. And the idea behind contextual interference is that we need the brain to sort of re-engage with it and think about it harder and think about it more. The way most people practice, especially when we're in phase one of practice, is just pure repetitions. They get it correct and they're like, cool, I got it correct, and then maybe move on and don't come back to it. Or they're like, okay, great, I got it correct, but I don't know if it's going to go correct every time. I'm struggling with consistency. So they do repetitions and repetitions and repetitions, trying to make sure that it's going to go correct every time and kind of testing if it's going to go correctly every time. And I'm sure you've practiced that way, and I'm sure you know that leads to a lot of inconsistency and not really getting it correct every single time. What deep learning does and what contextual interference does is it makes the brain have to think about it in a different way and kind of go back to that initial learning phase. You probably have noticed that you make the most progress when you're first learning something. You don't know the notes, you take a second to figure out how it goes, get familiar with it, get comfortable with it, and you feel like you've learned a lot and grown a lot. And then you kind of plateau and you just kind of keep doing repetitions at that plateau, hoping you get better. When you introduce contextual interference, doing practice rhythms, doing it in different keys, playing it backwards, playing every other note, doing different things, interfering with the context, starting on the second 16th of the beat rather than the first 16th of the beat, all of those kinds of things make you have to think about it again, make you have to work at it. And that's where the learning happens and where it gets sunk in more deeply into your long-term memory, and you get that deep learning and you get that encoding. The kind of fancy term, this one's actually a more straightforward term, but the thing we're looking for to know if your contextual interference is going correctly or not is desirable difficulty. When you're having that sensation of like, oh, this is a little tricky, I have to work at this a little bit harder, oh, I really have to think about that to make that work, that means that you're getting that desirable difficulty, you're getting it learned in deeper, and that's what phase two is about. Phase one, you get it correct, you simplify until you can comfortably and confidently do it correctly. Once you hit that kind of initial plateau of, okay, I've learned it, it's working, now what? That's when you start introducing contextual interference and going deeper with it. Now moving on to phase three, the sort of goal of phase three, the fancy cognitive science term is retrieval. Maybe the more simple basic term would be performance, and that's where you're pulling that information out of long-term memory, which is a different skill. Getting it correct is one skill, getting it deeply learned and really deeply encoded, a little bit different skill, and then pulling that out of memory and executing it in a performance is yet another skill. And all three of those skills need to be practiced, and all three of those things kind of need to be applied to a piece of music if you want to perform it at the highest level. So in phase 3 of retrieval, the tool we use to practice retrieval is called spacing. And the way spacing works is you pick the chunk of music that you're working on that you want to start practicing retrieving or recalling from your memory. You play it once like it's the performance, and then set a timer for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Start with less time. You can then increase the time as you get more comfortable and confident and more accurate in your retrievals of it. But you can start with a small amount of time. Go work on something else. Go do something else. When the timer goes off, come back, play it through once like the performance. And the point of this is it truly is performance practice. What we tend to do, and I've talked about this before with kind of practice mode versus performance mode, we're in practice mode, we're being very critical of how things are going and how things are coming out of the instrument. We make a mistake, we stop, we go back, we fix the mistake, we assess the mistake, and we work through that practice process, which is good and valuable and a great thing to do in phase 1 when you're working on getting it correct. But in phase 3, when we're working on retrieving it, we have to do it like it's the performance. Play it through once, don't go back and fix anything, just see how is it coming out of my long-term memory. Another benefit of doing spacing practice also is it will give you a much more realistic picture of how things are going and how things will go in performance. There's a lot of things in practice where we can work on that tricky bit, and maybe after the 3rd or 5th or 10th repetition, we're feeling pretty good about it. But in the performance, you're not going to have 3, 5, or 10 repetitions to get the hang of it and actually work it out and figure out how it goes. Because in the performance, you get one time through it, and that's all you have. Spacing practice, you do one time through it, and that's all you have. Now, as you're working on spacing and going through that, you may start to find that it's not going very well. Every time you do the spacing, there's maybe consistent mistakes or maybe a little bit different mistakes every single time. First of all, that's okay. And that's part of it. And actually, even as you make mistakes in your spacing and you have those failed retrievals, it's still valuable information for your brain, and it's going to sort of work out what it needs to do to become more accurate. But you may find that you need to go back to phase 2 or even phase 1. Maybe it's not learned deeply enough, and that's why it's not coming out well. Maybe there's just something that's just incorrect. Maybe you even mislearned an accidental and didn't realize until you were starting to do the spacing practice. That's totally normal and perfectly fine. You just have to kind of be assessing where you're at in that process. So I hope that gives you some ideas on how to start practicing like a pro who's never going to get it wrong, rather than an amateur who can get it right once or twice. Thinking about those 3 phases, with phase 1 of get it correct, make sure you know what correct is, and make sure that you're able to get it correct by simplifying it. Phase 2 of deep learning it, or really encoding the information, using contextual interference to find the desirable difficulty so that your brain continues to process it and continues to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the material that you're working on. And then phase 3 of retrieval practice, where you do some spacing, see what it's going to be like on the first go in the performance so that you know what you need to continue working on and get practice pulling that information out of your brain. So that's the 3 phases of practice. That's the way that you should be practicing everything that you're working on, especially the tricky bits, but really this applies to everything that you're working on. I will add also one little extra idea about that too. You don't have to go through that process on every single thing. There may be measures where you can sight read it correctly and have it good, so you don't really need to simplify it. And there may be measures that are so simple that you can retrieve it perfectly and get it right on the first try without having to do a ton of deep learning on it. It's all going to vary by the difficulty of the music and the familiarity of it and your knowledge and experience of playing those kinds of patterns before. So it's perfectly normal to not go through every single phase super in depth on every single thing that you're playing, but on the tricky stuff, it's great to really go deeply with every single one of those phases. So hopefully this has been helpful. Definitely check out the links in the description to learn more about Gregg Goodhart and maybe attend a practiclass where you can see these things being applied in sort of a teaching setting. And you can also go to quickstartclarinet.com/get-started to join my free members area and see a video of me applying it in one of my practice sessions and kind of talking through those 3 phases to see them in action in an actual practice, maybe kind of similar to how you would actually apply this in your practice as well. So thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. And last but not least, a huge heartfelt thank you to the Dennersons. This is like the Quick Start Clarinet family who supports the channel and helps to make everything that I do possible. If you would like to support the channel and get some awesome rewards in return where we can work one-on-one over video and you can have my full support moving forward on your clarinet journey, then go to quickstartclarinet.com/supporter.